They laughed at my apartment for over a decade. Last year, they needed my signature to sell the entire building. I remember the exact moment it started, a Friday afternoon in late August. I was standing outside my unit holding a grocery bag with discount labels still on it. One of my coworkers pulled up in a brand new truck and looked at the building behind me, peeling paint, old balconies, a flickering hallway light that never quite got fixed. He smirked and said, "Man, you still living here at your age?" I didn't answer. I just nodded like it didn't matter, but it stayed with me. The way people measure you by what they can see, the outside, the walls, the zip code, not the decisions you made when nobody was watching. I was 47 then, working 2 jobs, maintenance during the day and driving deliveries at night. My rent was $920 a month, half my paycheck gone before I even bought groceries. My daughter once asked me why we never moved to a nicer place. I told her we were waiting for the right time. What I didn't tell her was that I had already made a choice years earlier that looked like a mistake to everyone else. 12 years ago, when everyone around me was upgrading their lives. Bigger apartments, newer cars, better furniture. I did the opposite. I stayed where I was. I kept my expenses low, and I bought something nobody could see. A small piece of land tucked behind this very building. It wasn't impressive. No house on it, no sign, just dirt and paperwork. I paid $18,000 for it. People said it was pointless. Even the guy at the county office asked me what I planned to do with it. I didn't have a good answer back then. For the first few years, nothing changed. I still woke up early, still fixed other people's problems, still came home to the same cracked tiles and noisy air conditioner. There were nights I questioned everything, nights I thought maybe they were right, maybe I should have used that money to move somewhere better, look more successful, feel more successful. But I didn't sell, I didn't quit. I started reading instead. Zoning rules, land use, ownership rights, things most people ignore because they sound boring. But buried in those details was something most people never learn. Buildings can be replaced, apartments can be renovated, but land is the leverage, and over time I began to understand exactly what I was holding. Not something flashy, not something that impressed anyone at a glance, but something essential, something that couldn't be ignored forever. So I kept going, same apartment, same routines, same quiet life that people laughed at, and I let them laugh, because every month I stayed there, every dollar I didn't spend trying to impress anyone, I was building something they couldn't see, something that didn't need approval, something that would only make sense at the right moment. And that moment came the day the owner decided to sell the building, because suddenly the place everyone made fun of, the place they thought defined me, became the one thing standing between a deal and a dead end. And for the first time in years, nobody was laughing anymore. I did not rush into that meeting. I took my time. The same way I had taken my time for the last 12 years, I showed up in the same work boots I wore every day, same faded shirt. Nothing about me looked like someone who could stop a deal worth over $3 million. But that was the thing. Appearances had never been part of my strategy. The conference room was on the second floor of a downtown office building, clean glass walls, polished table, people in press shirts, and quiet voices. I could feel the shift when I walked in, not hostility, just that subtle kind of dismissal, the kind you get when people already decided who you are before you speak. The agent glanced at me and asked if I was in the right place. I nodded and took a seat near the end of the table. I did not explain anything yet. I had learned that explaining too early only weakens your position. You let people underestimate you. You let them build their assumptions, because when the truth comes out, it hits harder. They started going over numbers, timelines, closing conditions. Everything sounded smooth until they reached the part nobody could solve: land ownership. One of the investors leaned forward and said they had already secured most of the parcels, but there was one small section still unresolved. Parcel B, that was the exact phrase they used, like it was just a technical detail, something minor, something that could be handled quickly. The agent said they had been trying to contact the owner for weeks, no response, no clear path to finalize the deal. I sat there listening, quiet, steady, remembering every late night I spent reading those documents. Every moment I chose not to sell when things felt uncertain. This was not luck. This was time meeting patience. Finally, the agent looked around the room and asked if anyone had any information on that parcel. There was a pause, not long, but long enough. I leaned forward slightly and said I might be able to help with that. The room shifted again, not dismissive this time, just curious. The agent asked what I meant. I reached into my folder and placed a single document on the table. Nothing dramatic. Just paper, official, clean, and I said that. Parcel belongs to me. Silence followed, the kind of silence that does not need explanation. One of the investors blinked and asked if I was serious. I did not raise my voice. I did not smile. I simply nodded. They passed the document around, reading, verifying, recalculating everything they thought they knew about this deal. The same people who would not have noticed me in the hallway were now studying every word I said, asking questions carefully, choosing their tone differently. It was not about power in a loud way, it was about position. I had something they needed, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like I had to prove anything. The agent asked what I wanted. Fair question, simple question. But the answer had been building for years. I said I was open to negotiation, but I was not in a hurry. That part mattered, because when you are not desperate, you do not settle. They started discussing options, buyout, partnership, restructuring the deal. Numbers went higher with every suggestion. I stayed quiet again, listening, measuring, the same way I had always done. Outside that room, nothing had changed. The building was still old, my apartment still small, but inside that room, everything was different, because the one thing they had ignored, the one thing nobody thought to ask about, was now the center of the entire conversation, and I realized something in that moment. People do not laugh because you are behind. They laugh because they cannot see what you are building, and by the time they understand it, the conversation is no longer about where you live, it is about what you own. I did not give them an answer that day, not a final one. I let the room sit with the reality of it. Numbers kept moving across the table, offers forming and dissolving in the same breath. One investor suggested a quick buyout, another talked about long-term partnership. The agent kept glancing at me like I had just rewritten the entire deal without saying much at all, and the truth was I had been rewriting it for years without anyone noticing. I gathered my papers slowly, not in a rush, and I told them I would review everything and get back to them. That was important. Walking away when you can still stay gives you control. Outside the building, the air felt different. Not because anything around me had changed, but because I had finally stepped into something I had been building quietly for over a decade. I drove back to the same apartment, parked in the same spot, walked up the same stairs with the same worn railing. Nothing looked new, nothing looked impressive, but everything felt different. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar hum of the old air conditioner filled the room. The same sound that used to remind me of what I did not have now felt like a reminder of what I chose to keep. I sat down at the small kitchen table and spread out the documents, not just the ones from today, but everything I had collected over the years, county records, tax statements, zoning maps, all the things most people ignore because they do not look like success, but they're the foundation of it. I ran through every option carefully. Selling the land would give me a quick win, a number that would look good on paper, something I could use to move, upgrade, change my life on the surface, but I knew that was not the real value. The real value was position, leverage, the ability to decide how this story ends instead of reacting to it. The next few days I kept my routine exactly the same. I went to work, fixed broken units, answered service calls, drove deliveries at night. Nobody knew what had happened in that room. Nobody treated me any differently, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Quiet progress has a different kind of strength. It does not need attention. It does not depend on validation. It just keeps building until it cannot be ignored anymore. A few days later, my phone started ringing more often, different numbers, different voices, all polite now, all careful, asking if I had made a decision, asking what terms I would consider. The same people who once overlooked me were now waiting for my response, and I did not rush. I reviewed every offer, every clause, every possible outcome, because this was not just about money. It was about changing the direction of my life in a way that could not be undone. One evening, my Daughter sat across from me at that same table. She asked me if we were ever going to move somewhere better. I looked around the room for a moment, at the walls, the old furniture, the space that had never impressed anyone. And I told her something I had not said before. I told her that sometimes you stay in a place not because you cannot leave, but because you are building something bigger than the place itself. She did not fully understand. Not yet, but she nodded, and that was enough. Because I knew that soon things would change, not in a loud way, not overnight, but in a way that would make every year I stayed here make sense, and for the first time I was not thinking about leaving this apartment to prove something to others. I was thinking about what I could create from the position I had built, something that did not depend on appearances, something that would last longer than any upgrade or short-term win, something that started with a decision nobody understood and was about to become something nobody could ignore. I made my decision the same way I had made every important decision in the past 12 years, slowly, quietly, without needing anyone else to agree with it. I called the agent back 3 days later and told him I was not interested in selling my portion outright. There was a pause on the line. Not confusion, more like recalibration, because that answer changed everything again. He asked what I had in mind. I told him I wanted equity in the deal, not just a payout. I wanted to be part of what came next, not just the reason it could happen. There was another pause, longer this time, and then his tone shifted, more careful, more respectful. He said they would need to bring that back to the investors. I told him to take his time, because I was not going anywhere. That part was true in more ways than one. The next week felt different even though nothing on the outside had changed. I still woke up before sunrise, still drove to work, still carried tools into units where tenants barely looked up when I knocked, but inside I was tracking something else entirely, conversations happening in rooms I was not in, numbers being adjusted because of a position I had built years before. Offers came back higher, more structured. They were no longer trying to buy me out, they were trying to include me. That shift mattered. It meant I was no longer an obstacle. I was a partner they could not replace. One evening after work I sat in my truck longer than usual, engine off, just thinking, not about the money, but about what this actually meant. For years I had measured progress in small ways. Bills paid on time, a little more saved each month, staying disciplined when it would have been easier to give up and move on. Now those small decisions had combined into something that could change the entire direction of my life. But I knew something else too. Moments like this can make people rush, can make them trade long-term position for short-term comfort. I had seen it happen before. People finally get an opportunity and they cash out too early because they want to prove something. I did not want to prove anything anymore. I wanted to build something that would last beyond this one deal. The next meeting was scheduled for the following week. Same office, same room. But this time the tone was different from the start. There were more people in the room. Legal advisors, financial partners, people who understood exactly what was at stake. I sat down in the same seat as before, but I was not the same person they had seen the first time. They walked me through a revised structure, redevelopment plans, projected returns, timelines stretching out over years instead of months. They spoke to me like someone who had a stake, not like someone who needed to be convinced, and I listened the same way I always had, calm, steady, not reacting to every number they put on the table, because I understood something now that I did not understand before. Value is not just about what you can get today, it is about what you are positioned to receive tomorrow. When they finished, I asked a few questions, not many. Just enough to understand how the structure protected my position and how decisions would be made moving forward. They answered carefully, no shortcuts, no assumptions, and for the first time I could see the full picture clearly, not just the building, not just the land, but what it could become, something larger, something that would outgrow everything people had once laughed at. And as I walked out of that room again, I realized that nothing about this was accidental. It was built in quiet moments, in decisions that looked small at the time, and now those decisions were shaping something that nobody could ignore anymore. I did not sign anything that day, not yet, because I understood that once you sign, you are no longer in control of the conversation, you are part of it, and I was not ready to give that up. I went back to my routine again, the same apartment, the same work, the same people who still saw me exactly the same way they always had. One of my coworkers complained about rent going up again. Another talked about moving to a newer complex across town. Better amenities, nicer finishes. I listened, but did not join in, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned that not every truth needs to be shared, especially when it is still growing. That weekend I spent hours going through the redevelopment plans they had shown me, not just reading, but understanding, unit density, projected rental income, cost of renovation, timelines that stretched 5, even 10 years out. This was not just about a quick gain anymore. This was about stepping into a different level of thinking, ownership not as a single moment, but as a system that keeps producing over time. I wrote down questions, real questions, not about how much I would make right now, but about how decisions would be made when things changed. What would happen if the market shifted? How my position would be protected if new investors came. Later, the next call with the agent felt different again. He was more direct this time. He said the group was willing to move forward with me as an equity partner, but they needed clarity. They needed commitment. I told him I understood. But clarity works both ways. I asked for revisions, specific ones. I wanted my ownership percentage tied to the land value over time, not just the initial agreement. I wanted a voice in major decisions, not control, but not silence either. There was a pause. On the line again, the kind that tells you people are recalculating. I had seen that pause before, and I knew what it meant. I was no longer being fit into their plan. Their plan was being adjusted to include me. Over the next few days, emails went back and forth, documents updated, language changed. Small details that most people skip became the most important parts of the deal, because those details decide who benefits when things grow. One evening I sat at the same small table again, looking at the final draft they sent over. It was thicker than anything I had ever signed before, full of terms and conditions, but beneath all that was something simple. It recognized my position, not just as someone who made a good decision years ago, but as someone who now had a place in what came next. I thought about all the years in that apartment, all the moments that felt like nothing was changing, all the times I chose not to upgrade, not to chase appearances, not to explain myself. Those choices were all here now, written into something real, something measurable, something that could grow beyond me. I did not feel excited in a loud way. I felt steady, grounded, like everything was finally aligning with something I had understood long before I could prove it. I signed the agreement the next morning, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, and then I went to work like any other day, because that is how real change happens. Not in one moment that looks different from the outside, but in a series of decisions that quietly shift your position until one day the same place everyone judged you for becomes the foundation of something they never saw coming. The next few months did not look dramatic from the outside. Nothing about my life suddenly appeared different. I still woke up early, still drove the same route to work, still carried the same tools into the same units. Tenants still saw me as the maintenance guy who fixed their sink or checked their air conditioning, and that was fine, because the real change was not visible yet. It was happening in meetings and documents, in decisions that slowly started to reshape the future of that entire property. Construction plans were finalized, permits were filed, timelines were set, and for the first time I was not just hearing about these things, I was part of the conversations. I listened more than I spoke, the same way I always had. Because understanding the flow of decisions mattered more than trying to control every detail. The building I had lived in for over a decade was no longer just a place to sleep. It was a project, something that would be transformed over time, not overnight. Not in a way that shocked anyone, but in a way that steadily increased its value. New investors came in, new discussions happened, and every time something shifted, my position was there, written into the structure, protected, growing quietly. One afternoon I received the first report showing projected returns based on the redevelopment plan. The numbers were not small, but what stood out to me was not the size, it was the consistency, the way income would be generated over time. Not just once, but again and again. That was When it fully settled in, I had moved from trading time for money to owning something that could produce value without me being physically present every hour of the day. That realization changed how I saw everything. Even my daily routine felt different, not because I stopped working, but because I understood why I was still working, not out of necessity, but out of discipline. One evening, my coworker asked me if I was finally planning to move somewhere better. He said rent in the area was going up again, and it did not make sense to stay in a place like this anymore. I looked around for a moment. The same hallway, the same worn carpet, the same building people had laughed at for years, and I told him I might stay a little longer. He shook his head like he did not understand, and that was fine, because I had stopped needing people to understand my decisions a long time ago. The following weeks brought small visible changes to the property: inspections, early renovations, contractors coming in and out, tenants talking about what might happen next. Some were excited, some were unsure, but I saw it differently. I saw structure becoming reality, something that had existed only on paper, now taking shape in the real world. And every time I walked through those halls, I could feel the difference, not just in the building, but in myself. I was no longer just passing through this place. I was connected to what it was becoming. My daughter noticed it too, in a quiet way. She asked me one night why things felt different even though we had not moved. I told her sometimes change does not start with where you live. It starts with what you build beneath it. She thought about that for a moment and smiled, not because she fully understood, but because she could sense something was changing, and she was right. Everything was changing, just not in the way people expect, not with a sudden upgrade or a dramatic move, but with a steady shift in position. The kind that turns the same place everyone overlooked into something that holds real value, something that grows, something that lasts. And for the first time, I realized that I did not need to leave this place to prove anything, because what I had built here was already doing that quietly. Every single day as the months moved forward, the changes became harder to ignore, even for people who had never paid attention before. Scaffolding appeared along the sides of the building. Sections of the exterior were stripped down and rebuilt. The old paint was replaced with something cleaner, something that made the entire place feel different without changing its core structure. Tenants started talking more in the hallways, asking questions about rent, about upgrades, about whether they should stay or leave. And for the first time, I was hearing those conversations from a different position, not as someone worried about the next lease increase, but as someone who understood how those numbers were decided. One afternoon, a contractor stopped me while I was checking a unit and asked if I was part of the ownership group. I paused for a second before answering, not because I was unsure, but because I was still getting used to that reality. I told him yes in a simple way, no explanation, no details, just a fact. He nodded and started speaking to me differently after that, more direct, more respectful, like the role I had quietly stepped into was now visible to others, and that shift was subtle but real. I still did my job the same way, still fixed things, still showed up on time, but internally everything had changed. I was no longer just maintaining a place. I was watching something grow that I had a stake in. Reports started coming in regularly, progress updates, budget adjustments, projected returns shifting as renovations moved forward. And each time I reviewed them, I could see how the structure we had built into the deal was working. My position was not shrinking as more people got involved. It was holding, expanding with the value of the property itself. That was something I had insisted on early, and now I could see why it mattered. One evening I sat with my daughter again. She had noticed the construction, the noise, the changes. She asked if we were going to have to move because of everything happening. I told her we might one day, but not because we had to, because we would choose to, and that difference mattered more than she realized. She smiled in that quiet way she always did when she sensed something important, even if she could not fully explain it. The next major step came when the first set of renovated units were completed. They were not luxury, but they were clean, modern, better than anything this building had offered before, and they started filling quickly. Higher rents, better tenants, steady demand. I walked through one of those units after it was finished, looked around at the new floors, the fresh walls, the updated fixtures, and for a moment I thought about the first day I moved into my old unit years ago. The difference was clear. But what mattered more was what stood behind that difference: ownership, structure, decisions made long before this moment. I realized then that most people wait for things to look different before they believe their life is changing. But in reality, the change happens long before it becomes visible. It happens in choices that seem small at the time, choices that do not get recognition, choices that often get questioned, and only later do those choices become something others can see. As I walked back down the hallway that evening, I passed a group of tenants talking about how the building was finally becoming something better. They spoke like it had just happened, like it was sudden, like it came out of nowhere. I did not stop to correct them. I did not need to. Because I knew exactly how long it had taken to get here, and I knew that the most important part of it was never the visible change. It was the position behind it. The one thing that turned all of this into something more than just a place to live, something that would continue to grow long after the last renovation was finished. By the time the second phase of renovations began, the building no longer felt like the same place people used to joke about. The parking lot was repaved, new lighting installed, hallways brighter, cleaner, quieter, and with each change the conversations around me started shifting in a way that was impossible to ignore. People who had once talked about leaving were now asking about availability, asking how they could move into one of the upgraded units. Demand had flipped, and I could see it not just in the building, but in the numbers that continued to come in: occupancy rates rising, rental income stabilizing, projections adjusting upward, not in sudden spikes, but in steady, consistent growth, the kind that builds real value over time. One afternoon, I was reviewing a quarterly report when I noticed something that made me pause. The valuation of the property had increased significantly compared to the initial projections, not because of luck, but because the plan was working exactly as intended. Every decision that had been discussed in those early meetings was now translating into measurable results, and my share, the part tied to the land and structured into the deal, was growing alongside it. That was the moment it fully became real, not just on paper, but in a way that could be felt, understood, and carried forward. I did not react in a dramatic way. I closed the report and set it down, because I had learned that real progress does not need celebration to be meaningful. It just needs consistency. Later that week, I ran into the same coworker who had once asked why I was still living there. He looked around at the building and said, "This place is actually turning into something decent." He laughed lightly, like it surprised him. I nodded and said, "It is changing." That was all. I did not explain my role in it. I did not need to. Because the change spoke for itself, and I had stopped measuring my worth by whether people understood it. The next major shift came when the investors decided to expand the scope of the project: additional upgrades, long-term plans to hold the property instead of selling it quickly. That decision aligned perfectly with what I had hoped for from the beginning, because it meant the value would continue to grow over time, not just peak and disappear. During one of the strategy calls, I listened as they discussed future phases, potential refinancing, ways to leverage the increased value to acquire more properties, and for the first time I was not just observing that kind of thinking, I was part of it, contributing in small but meaningful ways, asking questions that reflected a deeper understanding of how these systems work, not just at the surface level, but at the structural level, the kind of understanding that comes from years of quiet learning and patience. One evening, I walked through the property again, slowly, taking in the details, the new finishes, the improved spaces, the people coming and going. And I realized that what had once been a place people associated with limitation was now something entirely different. Not just physically, but financially, strategically. It had become an asset, something with momentum, something that could support future opportunities beyond itself. And as I stood there, I understood something clearly. The most important change was not what had happened to the building, it was what had happened to my position within it. I had moved from being someone defined by where he lived to someone defined by what he understood, what he owned, and how he chose to build over time. And that shift, quiet and steady, was the one thing nobody had seen coming until it was already too late to overlook. The final phase did not arrive with noise or celebration. It arrived quietly, the same way everything else had, through Documents, decisions, and steady progress that most people would never notice if they were not paying attention. The property had reached a point where it was no longer being questioned. It was being recognized. Occupancy was strong, revenue stable. And the long-term projections had moved from possibility to expectation. One morning I received an updated valuation report, and this time I did not set it aside right away. I read it slowly, line by line, not just looking at the numbers, but understanding what they represented: years of patience, discipline, and choices that did not make sense to anyone at the time, now reflected in something real, something measurable, something that could not be dismissed or laughed at anymore. My position had grown beyond what I originally imagined, not because I chased growth, but because I stayed consistent when it would have been easier to quit. Later that week I stood outside the building for a moment before heading inside, the same place where people once made comments about my life, the same place I had walked in and out of without anyone noticing, and now it felt different, not because the building had changed, but because I no longer saw it as where I was stuck. I saw it as where I started building something that would continue long after I moved on. That afternoon my daughter asked me again if we were going to move. This time I gave her a different answer. I told her yes, we would. But not because we needed to prove anything, not because we were trying to catch up to anyone else, but because we had reached a point where we could choose what came next, and that choice was something I had worked for longer than she could remember. She smiled in a way that told me she understood more than before, not every detail, but enough to feel the shift, enough to know that something had changed in a way that mattered. I spent the next few weeks preparing for that next step, not rushing, not making sudden decisions, just planning the same way I always had, carefully, intentionally, making sure that whatever came next was built on the same foundation that got me here. I did not tell many people about what had happened, not because I was hiding it, but because I had learned that most people do not need to know your story for it to be real. They only see the outcome, and that is enough for them. One evening I ran into the same coworker again. He looked at the building, then at me, and said, "You got lucky staying here this long." I nodded and said maybe. I did not correct him. I did not explain the years behind that moment, because I understood something he did not. Luck is what people call it when they cannot see the decisions that led to the result. As I walked away, I realized that nothing about this needed to be proven anymore, not to him, not to anyone, because the truth was simple. I had spent years in a place people underestimated, building something they could not see. And by the time it became visible, the conversation had already changed, not about where I lived, but about what I owned, and more importantly, about what I understood, and that understanding was the one thing that would carry forward into everything that came next, long after the laughter had faded and long after the building became just another successful property in a city full of them, because the real success was never the building itself. It was the position, the patience, and the ability to see value where others only saw limits.